Very good.
Well, I'm Father Dale. You have 68 viewers right now.
Wow. Not counting the ones that are still waiting for. Okay, let's get on with the show here. As you can see, this is my title slide. On September the 25th, 1925, a train of 18 cars rolled out of Seattle on the Great Northern Railway, bound for St. Paul. The locomotive, number 2517, and his train made a run from Seattle to St. Paul in 52 and a half hours. 5 hours faster than the GN's premier train, the Oriental Limited. To add to the story, the 2517 then returned to Seattle with number 27, the fast mail, in 47 and a half hours. A remarkable feature of the run was the fact that one locomotive was used for the entire trip, out and back. In 1925, it was still common for locomotives to have their own assigned crew and their own assigned division. On the marathon run of September 1925, a total of 24 crew changes were made. The other remarkable feature of the Great Northern 2517 story is that the cargo that was carried by the 18-car special train, the cars were carrying raw silk from Japan, $5 million worth. The Great Northern and the other lines in the Northwest, including the Canadian Pacific, had been in the silk trade for many years. The first shipments to America from Japan had arrived in 1875. On the GN, the first dedicated silk train ran in 1910. By 1924, the number of Great Northern silk trains per year had risen to 34. The value of silk on the New York Commodities Exchange surged and fell as the supply varied. There were 3 separate Japanese shipping companies bringing silk to the West Coast. 4 other railroads were vying with the Great Northern for the silk traffic by offering faster service. Soon the GN running time from Seattle to St. Paul, 58 hours, was being surpassed by the Northern Pacific, the Milwaukee Road, and the Union Pacific. The first mountain class locomotives on the GN, class P1, came from Lima in 1914. Closely resembling the successful 01 class, the P1 had 63-inch drivers, oversized firebox, and weight-on drivers of 220,000 pounds. The P1 class was intended for passenger train service in an era when passenger trains were getting longer and heavier. And only 6 years, here's the mystery, 6 years later, the Great Northern took the P1s off the passenger runs and reassigned them to freight service in the Rockies. The GN returned to using 462 Pacifics and even 442 Atlantics on their mainline passenger trains for another 3 years. They decided that the P1s were not fast enough. Ted Doyle, in his reference sheet on the Oriental Limited, insisted there was a gentleman's agreement among the Northwest roads after the First World War. All 3 railroads offered 74-hour deluxe passenger service between Chicago and Seattle at the same average speed, 30 miles an hour. My theory is that the P1s were not fast enough to compete in the time-sensitive silk trade. 3 years later, 1923, the Great Northern took delivery of a new class of 482 locomotive, the P2 class. The P2 class had slightly larger cylinders and 73-inch drivers. Shorter, lighter main rods compensated for the longer side rods. The P2s were built for speed without the radical shaking that came with heavier rods, pistons, and valves. Forgot to mention the fact that this photograph was taken in Chicago. I don't know why. The mountains featured a 4-wheel truck in front for guidance at speed, a 2-wheel truck in back under the firebox, and 8 large drivers for speed without shaking. In all, there were over 2,000 mountain-class steam locomotives in North America. The record for the GN silk trains from Seattle to St. Paul was set in 1924, a year before the famous marathon. On August 13th, the silk train ran in 2 sections to St. Paul. The first section in 39 hours, 28 minutes. The second in 38 hours, 50 minutes. What locomotives were used? They were probably the new P2s, which were newly arrived on the property. David Plowden, in a spectacular description of his cab ride on a P2, insisted that he saw the needle on the engine speedometer go past 90 miles an hour and stay there for some minutes on the line west of Minneapolis. The story can be found in Dave Plowden's book, A Time of Trains. The famous run that earned the 2517, its sobriquet marathon, ran a year later, September 25th, 1925. The train consisted of 18 cars carrying $5 million worth of silk bales. It returned to the West Coast on number 27. The other event that added to the need for more power was the arrival of the heavyweight equipment for the new premier passenger service, the Oriental Limited. The hazard of using wooden passenger cars was prompting U.S. railroads to convert to all steel coaches, diners, baggage, and mail cars. Steel cars were safer, but heavier. The post-war era was a busy one after World War I. In the years between the Great Northern's purchase of P1s in 1914 and the arrival of the P2s in 1923, 23 other railroads bought 482s. Most of them were a bit less than the P1 in tractive effort. Only the Denver and Rio Grande 482 surpassed the GN Mountain Class P1, and not by much. The New York Central jumped in with both feet, 176 locomotives. By the end of steam, New York Central had over 500 mountain class locomotives. Of course, the New York Central didn't like the idea of calling their new locomotives mountains. On the water level route, they were Mohawks. Cylinders on the Great Northern P2s were an inch larger than on the P1s, but the stroke was 28 inches, 4 inches less than the P1. Again, the motive for the shorter stroke may have been to have less shaking. The other railroads had specified shorter piston stroke on their 482s as well. Axle loading on the P2 was 242,000 pounds, almost 3 tons per axle, more than the P1. Grade area was 88 square feet, 10 square feet more than the P1. The first 18 P2s, numbers 2500 to 2517, were oil burners and were assigned to lines west. The last 10, 2518 to 2527, were coal burners and worked on lines east. This shot was apparently taken on the east approach to St. Paul Union Depot sometime before the depot's completion in 1924. That's the William Crooks, the first steam locomotive in Minnesota, in the background. The Great Northern gave the P2s lots of attention in their advertising in those first years. When the new Empire Builder was shown to the press on June the 10th, 1929, the 2517 was on the smoky end. After the run to St. Paul with the silk train, the Great Northern placed O-scale models of the marathon on display in ticket offices across the nation. This photograph was made in 1929 at the Fair of the Iron Horse in Baltimore. In 1981, I remember seeing this model at the B&O Museum in Baltimore. Kind of wonder where it is today. The unusual horn in front of the stack was powered by compressed air. Steam from the whistle used to fog the cab windows in very cold weather, and this was a way to prevent that. The P2s were head turners across the Northwest for about 3 years. In 1926, the Mountain class was trumped by a new design. The Northern Pacific skipped the 482 class entirely by putting an extra axle under the firebox and calling the new engine the Northern. 3 years later, the first Northerns arrived on the GN class S1 and took over the Empire Builder, crossing the mountains from Cutbank to Whitefish. Also in 1924 was the introduction of the latest heavyweight equipment on Great Northern's first line passenger train, the Oriental Limited. The steel cars were safer in case of a collision, but they were heavier and required heavier and more powerful engines. Here is a P2 2524 arriving in Fargo. Details of the locomotive in this photograph suggest an early date, maybe 1925. It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon by the depot clock. I checked my 1925 schedule. This is a mystery train, not the Oriental Limited. Today, the depot is still there, but the 2524, the cars, and the water tank are long gone. Here's a much later shot of 2505 working freight east of Fargo. Notice the presence of an oil bunker in the tender. Coal was actively being phased out as locomotive fuel toward the end of steam. And I might add, as early as 1911 and 12, it was being phased out west. This is St. Louis, San Francisco, the Fisco Mountain Class 1522. It's on display at the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis. 33 years ago, it was restored to operation and ran a dozen excursions around the Midwest from Atlanta, Georgia to Lincoln, Nebraska. Naturally, there were lots of pictures taken of the 1522 between 1988 and 2002. The fun finally ended when the engine suffered a cracked flue sheet and was taken out of service. Today, it's back in the museum in St. Louis. Up in Canada, the Canadian National went for 482 mountains in a big way. The CN had 5 dozen 482s on its roster, the last group of 20 arriving in 1944. These last featured unusual 24 by 30 inch cylinders and 260 pounds of boiler pressure. The conical front cover, which is missing in this photograph, prompted the nickname Bullet Nose Betty. According to the story, engine 6060 was retired and put on display in Jasper, Alberta in 1962. There, a local man, Harry Home, visited the engine on a regular basis with grease gun and oil can, keeping the bearings lubricated in hopes of someday seeing 6060 run again. In 1986, he got his wish. He and a crew of volunteers restored the 6060 and ran it to the World's Fair, Expo 86, in Vancouver, BC. In 1938, the Illinois Central called in their roster of early 210-2 Santa Fe type freight engines and converted them into 482s for fast freight service. The first one to be converted was number 2500, now on display in Centralia, Illinois. Here's the newspaper photo showing the 2500 being moved from the yard in Centralia to its new display area, right down Broadway. The IC was so pleased with the 482 wheel arrangement that they stuck with the design until the end of steam. They never bought a 484 Northern. Here's a great shot of Illinois Central 482, number 2613, with an excursion train, October 14, 1959. The occasion was the 100th anniversary, listen carefully here, the occasion was the 100th anniversary of the L&N Railroad. But since there were no more L&N steam engines available, the L&N had to borrow the Illinois Central 2613 to fill in. To add to the paradox, the day after this excursion, the 2613 was sent to the scrapyard. Here's Pennsylvania Railroad, number 6755, on display at the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania in Strasbourg. The museum is much improved since I saw it in 1984. Their locomotive collection is no longer out of doors. The 6755 was the only survivor out of 301 mountains on the Pennsy roster. Its bell-paired firebox makes it look much bigger, but it's about the same size as the Great Northern P2. 72-inch drivers and 27 by 30-inch cylinders. Boiler pressure on the M1 was 250 pounds. Here's a New York Central Mohawk showing off for the company photographer with a long string of new boxcars. Here I am in the cab of New York Central Mohawk number 3101 in 1946. I fired on the Central back in the 40s until they found out I was underage. 3101 was one of 600 Mohawks on the water level route. Two Great Northern Mountain class engines have been preserved. One, 2507, was sold to the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle Railway in 1962 and was put on display in Maryhill, Washington, with an SP&S logo on the tender. After 20 years, the 2507 was moved to Pasco, Washington, where a group planned to restore it for excursion service. The project was never completed, and in 2004, the 2507 was returned to Wishram, where it remains today, in fresh Great Northern paint and lettering. The engine is covered, safe from the rain and snow, but not from the pigeons. The other P2 is in Wilmer, Minnesota. When I first saw it, the boiler had been painted a light turquoise, a sort of a faded Russian iron green. Some years later, it had been repainted black. After 50 years on display, the 2523 is being restored cosmetically by Kandiyohi and Kandiyohi County Museum. Finally, it's green once again. The fence will be removed and the netting will be hung in the rafters to discourage the pigeons. We were hoping to see 2523 in person at this year's convention in Wilmer. The engine was there, but we were not. Here's a write-up for the Kandiyohi County newsletter. The fence is gone. The photographs I showed you are 2 years old. The next item on the agenda is a new paint job. According to the latest Great Northern Goat, the GN Historical Society is picking up the tab for that. And the 2523 will be here to fascinate the coming generations long after we are gone. And I had time to add a few more pictures without captions. There's one of the old pictures of 2523 with its original display. I'm thinking back in the 80s, but I don't know if it's that far back. I looked for the maker's name. I think this is the Larry Fisher print, but I'm not positive. This is a classic photo. I have looked to duplicate this picture. The bridge is gone. There is a new interstate bridge here, but you got to stop your car on the interstate highway in order to take this duplicate picture. However, it has been done. And I guess this is the last one. This is a picture of what, 2505 on George Fisher's layout in Minneapolis. And I'm sorry to say it's a little fuzzy. Must have moved the camera. And finally, a better picture of 2507 in Wishram. And I think that's the last slide. Nope, that's the last slide. Hope you enjoyed it.
Well, thank you very much, Father Dale. That was very interesting.
Good.
Do we have questions?
Nothing in the chat.
I have a comment.
Go right ahead.
I remember back in about 1954, 55, when they would use the P2s on the cherry specials. It seemed like it would run for about a week or 10 days when the cherries were on in Washington. Would come through Litchfield around 4 o'clock in the afternoon at full speed. I never did see one on the passenger train. I was too young for that, but I used to watch them come through on the cherry specials. Does anybody else remember when they did that?
Pictures.
Hey, Dale, we've got two questions here that have popped up. First one, why was the P2 one of the only GM steamers without the bell firebox?
The explanation I heard or read in a book was it was a matter of weight, that they were so heavy that they had to kind of scale them back a little bit to keep them within limits. Just one excuse that I heard.
Another question is about those silk trains. What kind of cars did they use?
We have so few pictures of them, and there are always pictures of the locomotives, so you can hardly ever see the cars. My impression was that they were all baggage cars.
I believe that's correct.
Maybe a coach or two for the crews that switch back and forth.
The cars on the train were actually the old mail cars, the old wood mail cars.
Ooh.
There's several good photos showing that's what they are. Maybe the GM store will produce that car sometime.
Be darned. Hard to find information on silk trains. I found one good article on the internet about the Canadian Pacific silk trains.
CP, unlike GN, built dedicated steel silk cars, box baggage cars for silk cars.
Oh, yeah.
But just, I'm going to sort of divert here to kind of a personal remembrance. We had 6060 out here in the 80s doing some fan trips. And one went from Edmonton down to Calgary, and then from Calgary out to Drumheller. And for some reason, the co-op fuel truck could not find the only steam engine in town in Drumheller, which is not very big. We'd fuel 6060 before the trip back. So as a result, we were going to stab a CN freight at Rosebud. And so Harry Holm was at the throttle, and he got permission to run from Drumheller to Rosebud at the posted passenger train speed, which was 90 miles an hour, because they ran the Bud cars on that line. He didn't get up to 90, but Rick Walker, one of our club members, was riding in the terrible little SW 1200 RS they made us drag around in case 6060 were to break down. And he was looking at the speedometer in the cab. He said Harry got that thing just over 70 miles an hour. Not bad for an engine that age.
Harry Holm is a hero for a lot of people.
Yeah, gone now, unfortunately.
Great. during the rebuilding, there was a fellow from Cincinnati who went up there and took video and marketed the video. So if you look around, you can probably find a video of the rebuilding and a birthday party for Harry Home. The maker was, oh, for crying out loud, good friend of mine.
Yeah.
No, sorry, I can't think of his name.
Yeah, at one time, Harry had the idea that he would steal the Alesco feed water heater off 6015, which is still stuffed and mounted at Jasper, and put it on 6060 because he didn't like the exhaust steam ejector on 6060, but that never happened. But I was really surprised actually that they had to do another rebuild because the province of Alberta paid for a rather extensive boiler rebuild by a company on the West Coast when the engine was down there for Expo 86.
And they did?
Oh yeah, the provincial government paid for it.
Oh boy.
Yeah, then they sent it on a trip round and round all the way from Vancouver to Jasper to Prince George, and then down with Prince George, accompanied by their Royal Hudson.
Wow.
Nice.
You don't want to see the rail fan cavalcade following that train. I don't think the RCMP liked it much either.
How many miles long was it?
Tom probably remembers that one.
Yeah, I heard about it. I wasn't actually there.
Yeah, when they sent 6060 to Vancouver, they only gave it about like 10 or 12 grain cars to haul, so they didn't make much use of its capabilities. So it's really too bad those guys that were trying to get the engine out of Pasco, or sorry, not out of Pasco, out of I can't remember the name now, where they crossed the river. Father Dale just said it a couple of minutes ago. But yeah, they were going to take it to Mary Hill, I think. Get it to run.
Something you might be interested in, the order for the P1 Mountains from Lima and I think it was the H4 Pacifics from Lima were, both orders were put in about the same time. And it was Lima's first $1 million order for locomotives.
Father Dale, didn't the P1s eventually get turned into Q2s?
Yes, they did. They rebuilt all of them for some strange reason into a much slower and heavier P2 or Q2. But the Q2s lasted until the end of steam. Greg Scholl was the name of that video maker. You can probably find his ad in Trains magazine.
There was a couple more comments here. One was from John Barth. Patterson, New Jersey was known as the Silk City. It manufactured silk products, and this was the destination of many silk trains.
Wow. Patterson.
Also, from another person, 2523 is waiting for a paint contractor to have free time. Trade workers are very busy these days. That's all the comments.
Okay, thanks very much, everybody. There were 59, well, there are 59 participants.
Yeah, a total of 68 participants, Father. So that's really good.
Yeah.
So it was an excellent presentation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're sure welcome.
I will stop recording it right now.